Greeting. This is Glenn McKnight, the co-founder of the Virtual School of Internet Governance. I have a great guest today is Geoff Huston from the APNIC. He's the chief scientist, and he did a really great article for Circle ID, and it inspired me to call out to Geoff and say, can you actually elaborate on the article, because I think it's inspiring. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and his session is called The Future Networking Needs.
Thanks, Glenn, and good morning, afternoon, evening, whatever it might be for you. It is indeed a pleasure to join you, albeit a little bit virtually because, time zones, we haven't yet mastered that yet. So today, I'd like to use these slides to guide us through a little sort of understanding of where this is all going and, to think about the issue of what are the needs of networking. Now, I suppose I'd cheated a little bit because I actually had a brief from a couple of months ago, back in October of 2021, with an IBM workshop that they were doing, which had this brief of talking about where are computer communications heading? Where are these networks heading? And the interesting thing was they didn't say 5 years or 10 years. They said 50. Now, 50 is tough because 5, well, it's just tomorrow with a few tweaks. 10, drifting a bit, there might be some, discordant moments. If you'd predicted the future in 2003, you might have missed the iPhone. Wow. But 50 years is kind of way out there, just absolutely way out there. And so in trying to think about that, I actually thought about going backwards. What if this was 1971 and we were talking about the last 50 years? Because don't forget, the internet is just 50 years old as a concept, really. Packet networking was in the 60s, and the whole idea of packets and pushing it together and doing something was actually, a very, very early 70s. But that's not enough. Let's go back to 1921 just to think about the scope of change. And if we go back 100 years, which is, not many folk who were alive then are alive now, and the ones that were very, very young. So what was the dominant communications medium? Well, it was the post. If you were rich or a business, you could afford a telegram, but, in Australia in 1876, they connected the country up to the United Kingdom with a telegram service. A 30-word telegram cost 3 weeks' wages. Wow. So, the telegram really was the premium service. And it was so expensive that even the newspapers had to not encrypt, but compress the message, which was much the same as encryption, the way they used, using keywords to mean entire sentences, because they charged by the word. So interestingly, in the telegram world, they produced the official Telegram dictionary, and you could only use the words in the Telegram dictionary and no others. But I digress a little bit. But the point is, the dominant communications medium became the makeup of society. And because postage was so slow and so tedious in some ways, the business world found the projection of power difficult. To do command and control over these widespread dominions was incredibly difficult. The Boxer Revolution, it was the Opium Wars that the Brits did against the Chinese, happened by accident, and happened because the local dude out there in Asia decided to have a war and didn't inform the head office in Britain, hey, we're having a war, I need some help. Why? Because the post. Because there was no instant communication. Folk just did their own thing. Now, in 1921, we were organizing our world differently. So the telegram was pretty well established, albeit expensive, and radio and telephony were picking up quite a bit. Telephony, 1876, took the world by storm. Now, that's great. That's the makings of the next 100 years. But what would we have missed? Well, no one thought the fax. And by 1980, the fax was the form of use of the telephone network, particularly the international network. No one talked to each other anymore. We just sent each other faxes, voluminous faxes. Television, no one would have seen that. The amount of electronics, the amount of cramming, the movies were silent movies and they were on celluloid. The whole idea of bringing that into people's home and distributing it electronically, whoa, magic. Computers, I think Charles Babbage's analytical engine was still the model of the day, mechanical. And digital environments, you're joking. So all of those things would be completely out of your picture, even if you'd thought about 100 years in the future. It's like Jules Verne a few years earlier had to think of the future in the terms of the technologies he had at the time. So given that, what if we went to 1971? We've just gone to the moon. Oh my God, never saw that happening. What was happening? Well, interestingly, computers, Moore's law was doing its inexorable thing. Computers were getting smaller, the gate density was getting higher, and we were upping the clock speed. So the next big computer wasn't the size from a room to a building. People had thought about that, but the issue was, no. Let's just build the same power computer in a single rack rather than a room full of equipment in racks. Let's talk about mini computing. And rather than the state-of-the-art shared expensive computer, this project that the Yanks did called Multics, no. We're going to dream. We're going to dream the extravagant dream, the 50-year dream. You have your own computer. Your own. Oh my God, my own computer. Yes, this thing that cost tens of millions, whatever it was, I think it was probably more, was all yours. And the word Unix was a play on Multics to actually stress this fact, it was yours. And so this whole idea of computing becoming personal rather than so expensive, only governments and IBM had them, and they were shared amongst hundreds, if not thousands, was disappearing in 1971. It wasn't there, but it was coming. Now, what would we have missed? Well, by that time, almost everyone had a television, except I think South Africa. One of those countries had television very late. But, television had taken the world by storm, and literally the world by then. And this whole idea that computers would be like televisions, one in every house, never saw it. Never saw that transformation into consumer product. And we never thought to think that computers didn't just manipulate data, they were information. That transformation from numbers into not just facts, but helpful facts, things that could transform decision-making because it's information. We probably would have missed that in 1971. We were just doing better numerical calculations. We never thought that all that future computing power wouldn't be to solve harder problems. All that computing power would be to guess how our brain works and to actually create not just a better version of JCL, this weird language that only IBM could have thought of and only geeks could have invented. Rather than having users learn how to use computers, all that computing power went to make it so natural that I don't know, I was going to say a 5-year-old, but I guess it's a 3-year-old, could pick up one of these mobile phones and, sound and pictures and light, and you just point. All that stuff went into understanding us and how we work, not about solving bigger problems. So we never thought that. Even in 71, we weren't thinking that. Now, interestingly, when we thought about networking, the only paradigm we had, a bit like Jules Verne, the only paradigm we had was the telephone network. That was an amazing network, a real-time switching network that by the early 1970s, actually you could dial anyone else with a telephone on the planet, roughly. What a feat. What an incredible feat. We were switching time. And if you think packet switching is hard, it's not. Packet switching is easy. Time switching is incredibly hard. That whole synchronization of the world at 8 kilohertz was an astonishing feat. And don't forget, transistors were new. A lot of this was still done on valves. So packet networking was coming, but it was really unclear what the model was. And at the time, there was this massive war about datagrams versus circuitry. it still is unresolved. You know, MPLS is still out there somewhere. Hopefully you can edit that out, or if not, you know, yes, it's not COVID. So we were talking about datagrams versus circuits. This was the conversation. So the last 50 years, and I'd like to spend some time looking at that because the next is part of this. It used to be really simple. Networking didn't matter. It was just computers. The network was just a transmission fabric for these computers, and computers were still largely shared. This whole mini computer business was just taking off. So, you know, if you were of my vintage, you learned this stuff on a VAX 1178 at university, because that was the computer we all used, and hundreds of us piled into each machine. When we built a network, we put everything into the computer. The network was just the conducting medium, the copper pair, the brave folk who pulled fiber, God help them. But everything else was just the computer. So networking was incredibly simple in the 70s and even in the 80s. It was just transmission for computers. But Apple, and I think it was Apple that really made the change. That was the first revolution that Steve Jobs envisaged, because he didn't think of the computer, the Apple II, as a computer. He really did think of it in consumer terms. He used wood, not steel in the original case. Why? It's softer. It appeals. It feels more natural for people. And so by the 1990s, game over. You know, the personal computer was the customer's computer. It was the business computer. And we were building our computing environments based on distributing everything out and actually pulling out the mainframes or making them into a common storage point. But there was another thing that happened in the 1990s, because these weren't mini replicas of the mainframes. They weren't. We turned them off when we left the office. They were only on when we were there, and they were off when we weren't. And so we started to make this distinction between the things that need to happen all the time and the things that happen in front of your eyes. Customers and network. So what about the naming system? Who controls where the names are? Is that a distributed problem of computation in personal computers? Or was it some dedicated thing inside the network that, to all intents and purposes, looked like a network function? Well, we pulled it into the network. What about that astonishing artifact, the routing system? The self-healing, self-learning, distributed computation that some folk have actually called the most towering achievement of software engineering mankind has ever produced, which is a massive accolade for BGP. And it's not the world's most complex protocol, but it does a job that I suppose even in 71, we could never envisage going on. But it was a network property. Customers weren't allowed to play with routing for obvious reasons. They'd stuff it up in seconds. So that was a network function. And all these things about messaging, about content, about service. And so when we pulled that into the network, we actually made the network a distinct thing, and we had clients that weren't. And so we created this massive asymmetric system where there were clients who attached and used the services provided by what we called the network. But don't forget, what we're really calling the network is a bunch of digital services and the underlying transmission fabric. And so we've sort of hauled some things in and split everything off. And I've deliberately given you a picture of a modem in that slide because, yes, you know, the world was tediously slow. Modem screeches were part of everyone's word. And I want to use the telephone. Why are you on the internet was all part of the conversation of the 1990s. And we all spent a huge amount of time waiting for these damn things to do something. They did. And again, Moore's law comes into play. It just gets faster. Everything gets faster. And so we're now just building out like crazy in the 2000s. Why? Because when finally, after 20 years of sitting on it and stopping it, DSL finally got released to the great masses. AT&T have a lot to answer for, and this is one of them. It's quite an old technology. You stack up a whole bunch of voice modem calls simultaneously And it's just a bunch of 56K digital conversation, but you group them together and that actually becomes megabits. And we started rolling that out like crazy in the late 90s, early 2000s. The world changed from dial-up to DSL. The world changed from, I use the internet when, I dial in, to this computer is always connected to the internet. It does things while I'm asleep. It just does stuff. And so we have this always on network. To build the infrastructure, we moved from kilobits to tens of megabits. That's a scaling factor of 10 to the 4. Now imagine you build a bridge and it handled 100 cars a day. And tomorrow, that same bridge has to handle 1 million cars a day. That's what we're talking about. 10 to the 4 is massive. And we had to do it, not in 10 years and not with planning. This is deregulated. No one's in charge. Everyone had to scramble to get more fiber, scramble to get more undersea cable, scramble to get more computers, scramble to get more people, scramble to get their sort of supply lines working. We only did this because it was deregulated. I don't know where you come from, probably all over the world. I come from Australia. In the 1970s, and I'm old enough to just remember it, if you wanted a telephone in your house, heaven forbid, you put your name on a list and waited for 9 months. In 9 months, in the year 2000, we doubled the network capacity. And it happened over a series of successive 9 months because 10 to the 4th is an inexorable, tough scaling problem. No time, just money got tipped in like crazy. And so we started changing things simultaneously in every direction. Were we panicking? Of course we were. But it was a deregulated market. Everyone was merely trying to meet demand. And so we've invented all this infrastructure in the internet to stop the traffic splaying outwards, to actually try and make some sense. Traffic in Australia should stay in Australia. Traffic in the US, well, keep it to yourself, guys. We're not interested. So we built exchanges, peering points, gateways. We started tiering the internal structure of the network. We actually made role differentiation. Some folk moved packets around the world. We called them tier 1 ISPs, the really, really big folk. Some folk specialized in serving me at the edge of the network, the access networks. And there were folk with a regional focus or a national focus. And so we actually did role specialization. Why? To cope with growth. None of these enterprises were capable of solving the entire problem all of the time. And so the way we did it was to actually pick a role and play like crazy, work it as hard as you can, and just trust that everyone else is doing the same thing, because that's the way markets work. And so we started into this weird idea that we didn't have enough capacity, and we didn't. And so we did traffic engineering, which is kind of a current engineering term for rationing. You pay me more money, you get more bandwidth. You pay me $10 a month, well, good luck. But the folk who do pay me $1,000 a month, I'll look after their packets like crazy. I'll engineer the network to offer them premium service. We pulled all the data into the network. And that was one of the big changes that I don't think we realized how big until a bit later. Data centers and service farms. We never really thought about this, but some folk had it bad. The BBC was a very early adopter of the internet and started pushing out its programming digitally. Their servers melted. Microsoft, for all of its prescience, did all of its Windows updates and all of its content and all of its everything on a bunch of servers located in Seattle. And they finally realized that they had created a digital black hole in Seattle, because when the world wanted Windows 3 or whatever, all their packets went into Seattle. And so this place that had almost zero fiber infrastructure in the grand scheme of the world, Seattle was never a nexus of infrastructure. All of a sudden was the nexus of digital communication because all the stuff was in Seattle. Networking folk very quickly realized that building a network like the telephone, where the network was seamless, you just connected 2 edge points. Building the internet as a set of edge points was insane. It could not scale. Somehow, We had to think more like television. We had to put the content into centralized points and think of the network as a distribution medium one way. And that's what happened in the year 2000, around that period, because we couldn't build 10 to the fourth scaling any other way. You know, these were forced, unconscious decisions. And so if you ever bring up the word governance, I would say, no, it's just markets. We created the monster, and then we just spent all of our time trying to feed it. And the more we fed it, the bigger it grew, the more we had to feed it. And so every single idea under the sun gained credence. So yes, quality of service was a big thing in the early 2000s. I wrote a book on it, yay. The moral was, if you bought this book, you'll now know not to bother doing it. It's a waste of everyone's time. Circuitry reappeared, but we called it MPLS, so it sounded cute. It's just virtual circuits. Folk didn't want to sort of share the network with anyone else, even though the network was a shared medium. Like telephony, this was all about sharing. But some folks' concept of sharing is different from others. And so this whole idea of, well, I'll share the network, but I'm not really that trusting. Out come virtual private networks. This abstraction of it's my cable into it's my little piece of this shared medium. No intruders, please. Keep out. This is armed. And we started to specialize further, not just tiering, but into customer access networks and, of course, into content distribution networks. That was the infrastructure. And you kind of go, if we did this in the 60s or 70s, each time we invented a new kind of networking substrate, we invented an entirely new set of applications and protocols. When Ethernet came out in the, mid-1980s, early 1980s actually, when that 10 megabit local area network cable came out, Digital, for example, invented a whole new suite of protocols that only worked on Ethernet. And then the rest of the world spent a huge amount of time inventing things like Transland and Kalpana switches to make these Ethernet protocols work across the country. But, you know, think of the problem here, that every time we did a new networking technology, we had to invent a new set of applications and protocols. This was insane. And it was never going to scale at the rate we wanted it scaled. So why the internet? Because it didn't make assumptions about the underlying service. And, you know, there was always this joke specification of running the internet over carrier pigeons until some crazy Norwegians in Bergen actually did it. The point was not that, you know, carrier pigeons, how cute. The point was the internet was this universal glue in the middle, this universal substrate that said, I don't care about how you want to ship the packets. And I don't care about your application of how you want the packets to move in terms of what they're meant to be doing. I'll just make sure that whatever the underlying technology, if you give me internet packets, I'll ship them. It's the universal plug. Doesn't matter what's on top, doesn't matter what's on the bottom. It just preserved investment. So if you built an application stack with IP, that same application stack that you invented in 1980 would still run today. Everything would be preserved. So, you know, investment gets preserved. Why is that important? Geez, there are folks still running Fortran and COBOL. Oddly enough, despite all this progress, we have a huge historical legacy we drag along with us. And that value of preserved investment actually shapes a lot of our decisions that we make today. And so the internet was the true genius because it preserved that sunk investment. That was the reason why we stuck with it, that every time we went faster, it was still IP. And then, you know, Apple did two things in its life, and who knows it'll ever do a third, but both things were pure genius, just absolutely changed the world. Computers as consumer technology and everything that meant was genius. Taking all of that power and making it into a form factor that was tiny wasn't Apple's invention. No, 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 no. What Apple's invention was to get rid of the geek, to create a really simple set of paradigms. Now, again, this wasn't Apple's invention. They bought the rights to Xerox's work with their workstations. Xerox the most amazing failure of the entire computing industry. A photocopier company that invented the computing revolution. What is it today? A photocopier company. Oh my God, you know, everything that happened, you could trace back to Xerox's Palo Alto Research Center and the blinding stupidity of Xerox to invent it and then give it away. And they gave away the iPhone paradigm, this visual paradigm that you remove the JCL, the language. There's no keyboard on an iPhone and it doesn't matter. And people don't even think that there's no keyboard. It doesn't matter. You know, the 3-button device, which they're trying desperately hard to get to a 0-button device. Think about what that meant. It touched everything. So at this point, you kind of think of the rise and rise of the internet, and there was no natural barriers to growth. I didn't need to assemble, as US Steel did, 500,000 workers all working at these small number of massive plants. I didn't need that labor force. Because I had instant communication, there's no geography here. I can project power globally. And because I'm running so fast, and we'll return to that, there are no regulations that apply to me. Why are we in a mess with Facebook? Because when Facebook was growing, it was a regulation-free zone. So they just invented what they wanted to do. And quite frankly, this was novel business. And when you get novel business, like the Industrial Revolution and railways, when you get novel business, investors go crazy, literally crazy. They spend billions of dollars bidding for radio spectrum. Why? Did they foresee 4G? Did they foresee the iPhone? God, no. They're just crazy. Sometimes crazy bets pay off, sometimes they don't. But there's no coherent business model, and that's what we were having. And so the business models that got developed just simply ballooned out. They were traditional business models with a subtle twist. Uber, it's a taxi service, but we changed ride hailing. Whoa, took over the world. WeWork was an office real estate business, ordinary, pedigree of hundreds of years, but all of a sudden everyone went crazy. Cisco, Microsoft, you can see them yourself. All these models weren't regional, weren't national, weren't regulated in a traditional sense. Their scope was all of us, all the time, right now. And oddly enough, it created this bizarre, but I think in business terms, in a deregulated market sense, inevitable. Because when you get competition, neither player is happy. Neither. You either create a cartel where they sort of come to terms with the fact there are two of them, so they start talking and doing price fixing, or it's unstable. Why is it unstable? Because one of them wants to basically dominate the other. They want the lot. And what you get in markets all the time is winner-take-all environments. And because a small number of folk were moving extremely fast, all was truly all, everywhere, all the time, all 7 point whatever billion of us. That was what they were playing for. And so it was inevitable. It was an outcome of governance or the lack of governance. It wasn't anything other than sheer grinding economics. The giants came in. Now, initially, this venture capital was in the global terms tiny, but that small amount of money created billions of dollars of value. One could say that the best investment ever made by the US government was $40 million into the NSFnet back in 1987. You know, thank you, Al Gore. That $40 million created a huge amount, trillions of dollars of value for the United States, just from 40 million. Now, the private markets wanted to emulate that astonishing piece of government prescience. And so literally thousands of folk lined up, and the amount of venture capital wasn't tiny. Oh, sorry, it wasn't big, it was tiny. But they were able to take on the giants, and they were successful. And so it started to fuel itself. The entrepreneurial took over. But at some point, lots of small businesses that are basically undercapitalized don't work. Every entrepreneur wants to be bought out. No one wants to be there forever, apart from a small select few who find themselves as survivors, who find themselves as one of the giants who are left. And so we recreated America in the 1880s, 1890s, this post-Civil War industrial age fuel transformation of society. Regional businesses, village businesses, cottage industries became national. The railways, I could bring in raw materials, I could ship the product. I didn't need to be located close to my markets. That was so fast in its transformation, this same period of a couple of years, really, that the giants that got created told the legislators what the new rules were. And we've done it again. A really small number of players who are just decades in front of regulators, bureaucrats, and governments. And the whole idea of regulation to curb the worst excesses of an untrammeled market and its exploitative practice, gone. And we're living it again, once more. So we're in a new Gilded Age. And right now, who spends the most money in lobbying? Well, this is from 2017, but it's pretty clear that the US, military expenditure is tiny compared to what these tech giants are doing. This is now, if you will, the new battlefront in the regulatory and governance stakes. And oddly enough, it's not about the internet. It's about applications. It's about us. And so when we look at this sort of chart of where annual lobbying has happened, this has happened since around 2010. As the mobile phone took off in markets, the size of the internet ballooned out. In 50 years, if you take the size of the internet in 1971 as 1, what's the size today? I would actually argue it's somewhere around 10 to the 11th or 10 to the 12th. In other words, 1,000 billion, or depending on where you are on this planet, you might call it a trillion. That's how big the internet has become, and it's the same internet. So scaling is in everywhere, but this scaling has really bit home in the last 10 years. Who's doing it? Well, these days in 2020, it's still Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Alphabet. Alibaba was lobbying in 2020. The Chinese government did stop that. And of course, ByteDance, TikTok, they're all spending money trying to get the regulators to agree that what they were doing was right. They weren't trying to make the regulators do something. They were trying to say, what we're doing is correct. You just need to agree. Who's big today? This is from, I think, yesterday. And when I'm recording this, it's November. So things might subtly change. But oh my God, Microsoft, in US dollars, $2.496 trillion. This is insane. It's a software company. It has no assets. I can't point to a mine. I can't point to a farm. I can't point to a factory. I can't point to anything. $2.496 trillion. With Apple, I can point to some hardware, but that's really not its value. That's really not its value. You know what its value is? People are betting that after changing the world twice, they're betting it will change the world 3 times. It's not the iPhone, it's not the watch, it's not, Mac this or Mac anything else. It's not even the Apple Store. The only reason why folk are backing Apple is that they want Apple to do another Steve Jobs, to do another totally revolutionary change and make them trillions of dollars. Because if you look at the company itself, not much to it. Will it? I don't know. A lot of folk are saying it will. There's a fossil fuel company, Saudi Aramco. Why? Because oil's high this week. When oil drops, it'll drop. Alphabet, Google, oh my God. We've got to talk about Google at some point. We really have to talk about Google. Any company that runs 92% of all English language searches and a vast majority of searches in other languages is not only big in terms of advertising, yay, but because search is us. Search is our conversation. Search is how you resolve facts. Search is how you determine what's important these days. It's not the news, it's search. We've privatized society's conversations. And it's all Google. We need to talk about Google. And the rest, you can read them too. I do like Facebook relabeling itself as Meta, as folk have finally realized that social networks are toxic. Meta's still toxic, by the way. Its toxicity doesn't change when you change your name. And two that are interesting, because as we push Moore's law ever harder into strange realms of almost science fiction computation, there are two folk that are fueling this revolution. One is the astonishing sort of transformation of graphics engines into the workhorse of serious computation, NVIDIA. AI is done on graphics engines, or in actual fact, as you'd call it now, on AI engines, because we got rid of NVIDIA doing graphics cards because that's so 90s. And NVIDIA is actually a machinery, a platform, an architecture of incredible computing. That's important. And our dear friends at TMSC, the Taiwan semiconductor manufacturer, chip manufacturer, located in Taiwan. That's the only company on the planet. There are only three, Intel, Samsung, and TSMC, but TSMC did the investment. They spent the $40 billion and produced the narrowest track widths on their chips. And so this line of folk wanting chips goes out beyond the horizon. But you know what? It takes 3 weeks to make a chip wafer and an astonishing amount of water. Because over that 3 weeks, they wash it, wash it, and wash it, and wash it. In water so clean that if you drank it, you'd die because there's nothing in it. So you need lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of water. What are they having in Taiwan at the moment, as we speak? Well, a drought. Lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of water. Whoops. And so the chip manufacturer's got its problems. Why are you waiting for a year for your car? Well, there's a drought in Taiwan. Markets, gotta love them. So now back to the topic. The internet's gilded age. Yes, there's enough market influence in these small number of players that they just set the rules. They set the rules with their users. Here's the terms and conditions. Read them if you want, but it makes no difference. You either type agree or you don't, but you've got no choice. They actually set out the terms of engagements with each other. Who bought WhatsApp? Who buys Messenger? Who buys Telegram? There's only a few left and no one else is there and no one else is let there. Third-party suppliers, Foxconn makes for Apple, full stop. They make on Apple's conditions. They might as well be part of Apple for all it's worth. And they set the rules to the regulators and governments. They set the rules. This is the new Gilded Age because, quite frankly, they're amassing unparalleled fortunes that kings would probably dream about in the 15 and 1600s. And there's no accountability. No accountability. I'm a user of Gmail here in Australia. What if Google do something naughty? Where's my protection? Australia? Oh, go away. Australia's GDP is nothing compared to Google's global value. It's a one-sided conversation. And the Australian efforts to take on Google, prompted with Rupert Murdoch's decline of advertising revenue in the media, ended up in a face-saving, humiliating defeat for the Australian government. Humiliating defeat. And the basic lesson to everyone else is, don't take them on. You'll look like prawns. It just won't work. They're bigger than you. You can't set the rules. Now, there are side effects of this. Because while all of this is concentrated on how we think and what we want, the chilling side effect is that knowing how we think and knowing what we want is now the business. And certainly this is one of the more chilling books of the last 10 years, which talks about exactly where we are and why. Because most government agencies, they'd pay limbs to get the wealth of data that is sitting there inside these companies, sitting there inside the private sector. They know me. They know everything I do, everything I want, everything I might want, to the point where I'm not sure I really have a choice anymore. It's just I am their subject, and so are you. And the issue was, as the Europeans got a little bit miffed about, their attitude to data security. Google don't care. Google don't care about my privacy. They really don't. Apple don't care about my privacy. They don't. And neither does Facebook. What does Facebook care about? Facebook runs on Apple. Facebook runs on Android. What does Facebook really care about? They've spent a large amount of money getting information about me that they can sell to Facebook's advertisers. What they don't want is Apple peering over Facebook's shoulder. Google peering over their shoulder. Oh, you're learning that about the user. Oh, we'll use that too. Thank you very much, Facebook. Hey, advertisers, I've got a new profile here. Do you want to bid to advertise to it? So this whole issue of privacy has nothing to do with you and I. Nobody cares about you and I. They care about each other. They care about leaking. That's all they care about. So this surveillance capitalism truly is, in I suppose, the best sense of the word, evil. Just simply evil. So where are we? And why will this shape the next 50 years? Because like the Industrial Revolution, everything has changed. And it's not the internet, it's actually computers and the computer environment. The internet's almost irrelevant. These social changes are as big as the agrarian workforce moving into cities. And that was disastrous in so many ways at a human scale. Well, guess what? We're doing it again. And now we're seeing a very small cartel of monopolists, not governments, monopolists, setting this up. Now, we knew this would happen every time. This is Andrew Jackson in 1830, but yes, every time you let a monopoly flourish, the public interest dies along with it. What are they building? Well, they can't be any richer. They really can't. And again, an astonishingly good film. It was Roman Polanski's effort to make a gangster movie. There's one clip in there that just tells you why. How much are you worth? And the answer is, well, a lot. So why are you doing this? The meals can't get any fancier. The beds can't get softer. Why are you doing this? And he goes, well, it's all about the future. It's all about the future. In that list of the top 12 largest companies, did you see JP Morgan at the bottom there? JP Morgan was the financier of the railroads, the financier of US Steel, the financier of AT&T in the 1890s. They were a Gilded Age company, and they took their astonishing wealth, and they're still here in 2021 and 2022, and likely beyond. They bought a future. And Google remembered. Microsoft has remembered. Apple has remembered. They're building their future. So let's talk about this future. So let's try and sift out the noise from the substance, because there's a lot of noise out there. There are a lot of seeds of change. Some will be really cute. Dick Tracy's wristwatch communicator looked like rubbish until we started putting it on our own hands. That was significant. What else is significant? Well, rather than simply say, well, 50 years hence, blah, 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 I'd like you to talk about what makes it so. Now, the first is 10 to the 11th or 10 to the 12th of scaling. We've never seen this in the physical world. It's only in the digital world that we could actually build something that is scaled 1 trillion times bigger. Oh, sorry, viruses. Viruses and the digital environment both have this astonishing scaling property so far, and everything else is a scaling attribute. So what are we building? Well, the first is bigger, 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 bigger. How many processors do we manufacture each year? Current woes with TMSC notwithstanding. About 5 billion new computers enter the world every single year. 5 billion. Now, a lot of them drive lifts or do other mundane things like turn my windscreen wipers on my car on or off, great. But they're all processors, and they're all, oddly enough, see themselves with functionality provided through communication. So more communications, so increasing capacity. We've pulled every trick in the book, and there are still tricks to come. Photonic amplifiers, we got rid of switching electronically ages ago, wavelength multiplexing. All these cute technologies allow us for Google to announce its latest cables, which now are, I think, 11 terabits big from the west coast of America through to Asia. Doable. Terabits per second, because bigger. We're doing massive amounts of content transactions. How? Because the closest data center is probably next door to you these days. We don't use the network to move data. We use the network to fuel the edges. And the edges of these data centers that now aren't big hulking warehouses, they're the back end. The front end, the blade servers, the petabit rack systems that Netflix put inside internet service providers. So what we're seeing now is a build to the edge. So rather than driving all the way to the shop has put a shop front next door. So we stop making the network connect us together. We don't use the network to connect users to that server in Seattle. No, no, no. We serve from the edge. And the network is just a fueler for the edge. Now, this creates something that we never thought possible. We have defeated physics. Because while the content might have originated, let's say in Seattle, which for me is 140 milliseconds away, a little over a tenth of a second. But that same data is actually served from someone just down the road. And instead of 140, a tenth of a second to get there and back, it's now a thousandth of a second or less. This is blindingly fast. You'd have to be my age to remember a slow internet, or you have to be living in a part of the world that's only on slow satellite, because the rest of us sitting on fiber systems with data centers right beside us, wow, so fast. How? Like the food mile system that we talked about a lot. How far did your food travel to get to your plate? How far did your packet travel to get to your screen, to get to your device? Well, like food miles, this has shrunk like crazy. It's now down into single units. And with 4G and 5G, it's getting even better. This is astonishing amounts of engineering at the edge. It's faster because we changed the network architecture completely. And now we want to shave nanoseconds off those milliseconds. And we're actually pushing more and more functionality into these devices, because what we want to do is reduce the number of transactions to get the screen to respond. We're down to 2. The challenge is, can we make it 1 transaction to deliver what you wanted? Just 1. To make it so fast, it's intuitive. We're making heaps of progress with better. Now, for a network, what's a good network? Well, in theory, a good network does indeed keep my secret secret. And we've talked about exactly what that means, and I won't repeat it here. But the issue is we've done a huge amount of work with what used to be called weapons grades encryption. And now, certain browsers, if you go to a site that doesn't use encryption, it'll kind of go, no. You're not going there because this is open and that's bad and I'm not going to take you there, says the browser. Mm-hmm. The last piece of open information in the TLS protocol, the protocol that everyone uses, is now being sealed up. And all those countries that thought that the server name indication field was open slather forever, the sun is setting. And that last porthole is being sealed up. And now we're actually looking at those servers in that data center going, I don't think I want to tell you it's me. I don't. I'm going to make myself oblivious. And we've now got oblivious DNS and oblivious HTTP. So even the server doesn't know it's me. There's nothing left. The network that we used to treat as part of the fabric is now not trusted. It's treated as untrustable. It doesn't matter what you folk do to the network and how much you tap it anymore. We've assumed that's what you're doing. So do your best or worst. Doesn't matter. We don't trust the network anymore. There's no information left. Now, you'd think all of this would be astonishingly expensive. Astonishingly expensive, but it's not. We're living in a world of totally abundant comms and computing. What's the cheapest, where is the cheapest mobile data in the world? Dollars per gig. Or to give you a clue, it's not the US and it's not dollars per gig. It's fractions of rupees per gig, and it's in India. We're making systems that these days you only pay a lot if your provider is gouging you, because we can build this stuff, and we do, incredibly cheaply. I don't pay for Google Mail, neither do you. I don't pay for my Google word processing. I don't pay for Facebook. I don't pay for search. I don't pay. Why? Because I'm paying with an intangible asset, my future purchases. I'm paying with advertising. We've taken over the newspaper business of advertising funded. We've taken over television. We've taken over advertising, and we use that to fund everything. So this former luxury service that would cost 3 weeks' wages to send 30 words is now everybody, and none of us pay with, if you will, tangible goods. We've sold what we can't sell individually. Geoff can't go in the marketplace and sell Geoff's future purchases to advertisers. I'm like, really? I can't. Neither can you. None of us can. But Google can and does. Facebook can and does. The small clique of providers has taken over my future purchases and sells it. And what I get back is something that 50 years ago was impossible to dream and will be the driving factor going further. I get what I want because it's all about me. I'm driving this, and so are you. The user is indeed king, not the telephone company, not the government. It's us. So it's all good, right? Or maybe wrong, because we are changing things so much that we're not sure how it's going to play out and who ends up at the top of the heap and what bits get discarded. We spend a lot of time obsessing in a lot of these governance forums about, well, the V4 system is running out of addresses. We have to move to V6. No one's moving to V6. What are we doing about this massive fracture at the bottom of the technology of the internet? We have a problem. Or is that 1980s technology run to the end of its natural life? And quite frankly, in 50 years, we'll wonder why we ever even thought it was important. The whole ICANN domain name, naming system, the golden trough of value, selling names. What an ephemeral concept. Are names an attribute of the network, or are they just a service environment? Where's the DNS going? Because in this kind of system, names aren't absolute. They're just relative to my data center. I don't push packets around the world anymore. I don't need to. And so how do I communicate with you is actually more important. How do I talk about references? Dewey Decimal numbers in a library, if you remember it, the Library of Congress catalog number. How do I talk about things in this kind of world? That is maybe the fundamentals of what's important. And quite frankly, if there's no common network anymore, because every data center feeds off private cable, what's sharing? Why do we have an internet? Why bother? Because if it's so abundant, everyone builds their own network. That's what's going on today. And so we're pushing everything about consumers off to the edge. Transmission is now cheap and abundant, so we don't need to share it. It's not the scarce resource. You don't need to have a seat on a large shared aeroplane anymore. You have your own aeroplane, your own. That's what we're doing in transmission. We have so much networking, so much computing. We actually don't need to bring the users to the service delivery point. We just send the services out beside each and every user. So much that we can contemplate something that was previously unthinkable. It's now that the application is the service. It's not a television. It's not a window to somewhere else. So when we talk about internet governance and networking, the fundamental question that should rock the next 50 years is this a conversation whose time is closing? Do networks matter anymore? Because if we've stripped out so much, what's just left is what we thought about in the 70s, dumb pipes. What defines the internet? Common network? Nah. Common protocol? What protocol does Facebook run to feed its data centers? I don't know, and you don't know, and neither of us care. Neither of us care. So is the internet a common protocol? Well, no. Common address space? No. Common what? Or is it just a disparate collection of services that share a common reference? I can talk about Facebook and you know what I'm talking about. That's all it is. That's maybe where we are. And so this internet governance debate, think hard, because there hasn't been any governance in the first 50 years. It's just been this relentless struggle to cope with scaling by a factor of 1 trillion. That's all we've been doing, scrambling and stressing every supply line to make this work. And what we've done is, as we've mastered something, we've commoditized it. We don't care about transmission. There's no money in it anymore. The former gods of transmission, the telephone companies, are now just cheap commodities. Who cares? We used to obsess about platforms. Microsoft was rich as hell because Windows, because a common platform. It's all Android, but no one cares. Nobody cares, not even Google. Google doesn't make money out of having 88% of all the world's devices running Android. They've commoditized it, devalued it, and thrown it out. We all run Android, but nobody cares because it's a commodity. So we're moving up and up and up. And now the applications matter because value moves up. All those folk in the top 12 is actually the top and the bottom. NVIDIA and TMSC and everyone else makes applications. Nothing else in the middle. Value has moved up. So, maybe this is all about just catering to users, because we've now got 7 billion people who have things they want. And we're just spending a huge amount of time trying to cater to those needs. And so we ripped apart this whole model of a command and control economy of communication. We ripped apart the telephone monopoly, the government regulated monopoly, or the AT&T monster in Northern America. We just pulled it apart. And government said, we don't need to invest in this anymore. It's not so expensive. We need to be there. The market is doing just fine. This is a market where user preferences rule. And forecasting what users want is really good. Shaping what they want is so much better. And monetizing that is really the key. And that's where we are. It's not the internet. That's died. Many fans of Red Dwarf, yes, preposterous. Where would all the calculators go? There's no silicon heaven anymore. The internet's over. The only thing I could offer you is some vague hope over the next 50 years in this rather bleak summary of a world that has gone out of control, absolutely out of control, where governments are now powerless, where even individual players are locked into this relentless cycle of scaling, is that it will stop sometime. Like Edward Gibbon in 1776, that wrote this mighty work of the Roman Empire and traced it from the height to its ignominious fall of Byzantium. This too will pass. The best one can hope for in all of this is that, unlike other revolutions that have happened in society over millennia, we won't lose too many folk along the way. We can do this without sweeping armies across land. We can do this in a way that won't have the terrible social costs previous revolutions had. If we can survive that, I think that's a towering achievement, and nothing else really matters in the long run. So yes, this too will pass, and our goal is to make it pass as painlessly as possible along that way. Thank you very much, and back to you.
Great, fantastic presentation. I have a bunch of questions, and unfortunately, we don't have our student body with this recording today, but I'll be leading the discussion in our Group F. Going back from, I guess, my first comment on the Roman Empire, it did rise and fall, but it was a 700-year run, so they did have a bit of a party for a while there. Let's talk about the fragmented internet. So people are talking about the new IP, Hiwa suggested that in the last few months. Any comments on where the new IP is going, and is it something that ICANN is hip to, or how do you see it evolving?
I liken this to a bunch of horse breeders wanting to bring back horses.
Ah,
It's just all wrong.
okay.
This whole idea that devices are dumb, that devices need a network to help them along, devices need environment prompting and orchestration, is so 1980s. It's a desperate attempt by a savaged networking industry trying hard to buy itself another 10 years in the face of ignominious, relentless death. They're dying. And as they die, the ideas become more and more outlandish. And this is an outlandish and stupid and economically insane idea. The world is not ready or willing to do what it did in the 1980s again and invest in cleverer networks, because we've done that. We're over it. We don't need to centralize the asset, because that degree of computing complexity is abundant. My mobile phone and yours is a supercomputer. I don't know what's in this camera that's taking my picture, but even that's a supercomputer. And you sit there and go, we need clever networks. It's kind of, what world are you living in? And will you stop banging these rocks together? We're over it. And so, yes, only the hardware vendor industry, who are busy making routers, are trying to league up with the network providers to bring back the gold-plated bathroom taps that the telephone industry had in its heyday. This is retrograde, but it's also not a problem, because no matter what the hype, it's nonsense. It's economically insane and largely irrelevant. And so I wish them all the luck in the world, but my frank assessment is, bye. It's not an issue. It's just not in sync with where the entire industry has finding and will find investment and value. So yeah, networks don't matter.
The one thing that is consistent is change, for sure. So let me go pull up a concept. Dr. Christensen talked about something called disruptive technologies. And I think what you in your thesis of your presentation today is a little bit more than just the issue of disruptive technology or cyclical disruptive technology changes. So what is do you adhere to his concept of how he saw the evolution, or it's not an evolutionary concept?
Unfortunately, I don't think it's an evolutionary concept. I think this is all about periodic revolutions.
Okay.
And what you actually find is that, oh God, you could talk about the French Revolution, don't trust that Robespierre guy. He's a nutcase. But the issue is, you get an established order in society with various strengths and weaknesses, and the weaknesses become points of pressure, the strengths become points of support. At some point, the weaknesses start to surface. Now, you can try and evolve your way around that problem, but generally, the incumbents don't like change. That's why they're incumbents. And as the pressure to change gets to the tipping point, the change is violent, absolute, and no prisoners. It's just change.
Yeah.
But at that point, you have a new incumbency, and that incumbency starts building the bricks together. And so when you look at the American Gilded Age, despite Congress's rather pathetic attempts with the antitrust legislation, what happened was that the previous giants of the 19th century disappeared, and a new set of giants established a century-long reign, not only in America, but if you look at Ford and General Motors, across the world. And it was a relatively stable period for them until, the pressures build up, they get over the height of the dam, things just break. And so anyone who thinks that change is evolutionary, gentle but consistent, and accommodatable, I don't know what world they're living in, but it's not mine.
Right.
In my world, these things ferment. they breathe seething resentment. They attract supporters, they attract investment, and then they just unleash with all of their fury and pull the last one down and hoist themselves up there too. Yay, Napoleon.
Can I just go back to that one chart you had in 1971 compared to the, I guess it was a 2020 list of the top 20 companies on the stock market. So I guess only one of those 20 were on the stock market in 1970. I guess everybody else on that list were just a vision in somebody's eye. I take it the top companies were all the standard companies, and many of them probably are gone.
Well, this is the thing. A few of them, the biggest, and that's, I think, the qualifying factor, the biggest built their future and everyone else died. So who's around from the Gilded Age? And they're a force to be reckoned with, even if they're not in the top 12 list of loonies.
Right.
There's JP Morgan.
Yeah.
Oh, General Electric. Oh, Westinghouse. I'm trying to think of the others that have been around for that period, but those three, US Steel.
Right.
Now, some of them might be ghosts of them former selves, although General Electric and Westinghouse, they're still massive, but nevertheless, the big ones built their future. And the current big ones, not all of these 12 will be here in 100 years, but at least one of them will. And maybe 3 or 4. As the world changes, these folk will have bought themselves an assured seat at that table. Absolutely.
For sure. It just illustrates how nothing is permanent, but there is. Go ahead.
Nothing is permanent because, as I said, the issue comes that incumbency and long-held incumbency, and you look at Edward Gibbon's Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, corruption, nepotism, decay, stasis, all of these things that tend to be repressive to a human spirit that sees their life on an arc of improvement. Their children's lives will be better than theirs. All of this arc of making things better requires a social response. But if the social response does not exist, you were born in this caste, you will live in this caste, you will die in this caste. No one wants to live in such a society. We don't have that aspiration in most human societies. We actually foment individually change, and that get expressed collectively.
Right.
And so the societies that were stable the longest are actually societies that are more repressive of the individual, that effectively emphasize the stability of commonality, and they find it difficult to jump on the bandwagon. China's problems in taking on the US, it's not economic. It's not even logistical. It's not resources. A society that stresses the collective over the individual is always going to find it difficult to come to terms with grinding, inexorable, massive shifting change, because the collective has to change, and that's so damn difficult. Yeah. So the US, oddly enough, and it was, I think, almost an accident of history, going broke in the US is a virtue. Didn't Abraham Lincoln go broke 1 or 2 times?
Many times.
The whole idea that the old aristocracy in Europe going broke was a sin. How dare you try and take on the order and lose? That's the ultimate crime. In America, it's kind of, try again, try again. And that culture, the internet, in my view, could never have come from old Europe and never have come from Asia or Africa or South America. It was never, ever going to happen. It wasn't going to happen in Canada or Australia because we take bankrupts and lock them up.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a sin. Whereas in America, it's kind of, tough luck. Try again. Okay, I'll try again.
Now, on the flip side of that, Geoff, is that we're in the midst of a trial for Theranos with Elizabeth Holmes. She emulated, she even dressed in a certain way to emulate Steve Jobs, and the idea there was fake it till you make it, right? So many people said, "Oh, here's a great opportunity." Kissinger put in $6 million, and the list goes very, very long. So you have some, like, the desperation of the capitalist market looking for that next great thing. So I think it's been a problem. We saw the bubble that happened in 1990, I think, the internet bubble. Lots of people lost money because, again, it was more vaporware, right?
Yep. Quite frankly, this is a new imagining of our world. Like, the entire digital environment is so bizarre. Yeah, yes, Theranos was a fine attempt, But what's the Apple Watch, Apple Health, other than a fine attempt?
Yep.
And, you know, we're insanely wrapped with Apple. $2.5 billion market capitalization. So in some ways, the stories are not that much different. It's just that Theranos got caught faking it before they made it and got caught out badly. And by that stage, they were locked into something that they promised that could never deliver. I think that the lesson from others was, you know, don't be quite so outlandish. Don't be quite so far out. But, you know, it's fine to dream. And we dream. Absolutely, we dream. I find it amazing, and I think anyone who should find it amazing, is that I can type random stuff into Google and search the knowledge base of the world and come back with an answer in 1 second, less, faster than I can actually perceive, and it costs me nothing. Talk to a librarian of 1850 and show them Google, and their brain would explode. This is not possible. You haven't read every book. You haven't memorized it. You haven't put it in a retrieval system that comes back with answers in, you know, hundreds of milliseconds, tops, fractions of milliseconds normally. So dreaming is fine. And even failing is fine. You know, these folk gather momentum and it just all goes out of control. But this is the sort of elements of what we're building. At some point, change becomes impossible to sustain. We have literally ripped ourselves apart in the last 50 years to do 10 to the 12th scaling. Trillion scaling has been, money gets thrown in the air, lands differently, investment plans change, everything changes. But at some point, it's not sustainable. You know, in spite of my wanting a better life for my children, I actually like tomorrow to be much the same as today. You know, we strive for some elements of stability inside all of this. The new incumbents want stability. You know, Google's not planning to go out the back door in the next year. Neither is ICANN or the domain name business. They're not planning for instant, you know, calamitous death. And so the incumbents want stability as much as the previous incumbents did. So this is why I see change as a process of periodic revolutions in this enterprise, the same as society does more broadly.
Great. I'm going to add your suggestion for the reading list on Zuboff's book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. It looks like it's a great tome to add to the curriculum. So I think we covered a lot of material. It was can't believe it was 50 years, but we did it in an hour and a half. It was great pleasure to have the time shared with you. I'll send you the video so you can add it to your site. And I think it's great because your presentation, without the value-added comments that you provided, it's interesting, but you put context to what you were thinking, and I think it was really quite helpful. It made a lot more sense actually, spending the time together. So I'll add this to the tome, and again, it's building within the curriculum that we've established. So that's great. Again, thank you again for your time.
Thanks a lot. And
thank you. Bye-bye.
If folk want to ask me questions or anything, I'm always around.
I would be happy to do that. Thank you again.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.